I know that representation has kind of like had a big impact on your journey into CS. I'm wondering if you could kind of unpack that and maybe talk about what are recommendations you have for kind of improving not just representation, but like equity and inclusion in general.
Yeah, so I definitely think equity, inclusion, diversity is very important. And all the stories you hear, you should believe them. You should believe someone when they tell you that this has happened to them. My journey through computer science with the diversity, like right now I'm in the stance of like diversity is super important and we need to be proactive about it. My journey through it was, I think, very typical in some ways, where I started out kind of believing what I was being told without super experiencing some of it. And then the advantage of being raised by a white male and being half Japanese, so as part of the model minority, my parents basically raised me as being half is awesome. And so I was like, I am an awesome person. I am a hybrid. It is cool. And then I had enough self-awareness also in college. When I got to college, I remember my intro CS class looking around and like counting. I'm like, oh, 66 people, 6 girls. There's not many of us. I stood up, scooted over to the closest girl and sat down. I'm like, hi, my name's Kristin. I was self-aware enough to know that like I needed friends. I needed to make friends, so I had a community. So I think that for representation, it's important. And I think I'm still going through that journey of figuring out how best I can support it, to be honest. In undergrad, I was part of the women's group. In grad school, I was also part of the women's computer science group. And after being co-president of that group is when I founded my EECS Peers group, which is the grad student support group. I made it by recognizing that people needed support, but I hadn't even at that point recognized that one reason why you needed that support was because someone who is a minority doesn't necessarily have that network easily at hand. Mm-hmm. Like I made that group because I recognized this deficit, but I didn't recognize that it might have been stratified by racial or gender lines. I just recognized like, this is important. More people need this. So I'm going to form this group. And the group exists to this day. And basically the idea of that group is that there is a group of more senior grad students who basically are willing to put their name and faces on a website that says, if you email me, I will give you the time of day. And I don't have to know who you are. You can be a completely grad student, a completely different lab than me, but I'm willing to talk to you and go out to coffee with you to talk about whatever troubles you. Now that I'm a professor, I'm definitely having moments of like wondering how I can help people more. And this is when I wish my classes actually weren't so big, because I can't get to know my minority students without making it potentially feel weird.
And your classes are like 200 to 300, right?
200 to 300 students. I ran the numbers and I did find at least that the intro CS class that I mainly focused on teaching the past couple of semesters racially matches the Duke University racial proportions. But unfortunately, the non-Asian white, so the minorities in computer science are very small, even at Duke University.
Right.
Which is basically everyone who's not white or Asian. And I'm now kind of wrestling with trying to figure out like, what can I do to support the students? At the very least, if a student emails me and tries to contact me or comes to my office hours, I definitely try and like get to know them better. But unfortunately, that requires them to start the interaction. There's a clear power dynamic there. And that's also kind of puts aside all of the students who, to them, it wouldn't even occur to them to talk to the professor.
Right.
I recently read an excellent book called The Privileged Poor. Excellent book. And The Privileged Poor was an interesting book because it basically looked at 2 groups of students that would be classified as poor. One group was privileged because even though they were from a lower social economic background, they were able to access higher quality at schools. So they got a scholarship to go to a private school or something like that. And then you have the poor students who are basically underprivileged, and they didn't have access to those tools. And so these 2 groups of students, demographic-wise, look the same. But in actuality, they are very different in how they potentially handle school, handle college especially. The ones that had access to private schools who were privileged poor already went through culture shock because of how they are poor and potentially many of their peers are not. They already went through that culture shock in high school. And so it doesn't bother them as much that their peers do not understand what it's like to be in a lower socioeconomic bracket. And on top of that, they also have learned all the soft skills and the soft rules about how to interact with adults, how to interact with professors, how to access certain resources, while a underprivileged poor student is going through culture shock during college and has no idea how to access any of those resources, potentially until their third or fourth year, when learning that is kind of too late to a certain extent, assuming they make it that far. So like that is an excellent book that really kind of helped me realize, like, I cannot wait for students to come to me. Like the students I most want to help are not going to come to me because they're scared.
Right.
Small little Asian girl, they're still going to be scared of me just because I have all the power in their minds.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of currently wrestling with, like, how do I get students to reach out to me more, or to reach out to students in some way? I don't have answers to that, unfortunately. I'm excited that we hired Nikki Washington. She is an amazing African-American woman. She got hired as a full professor of the practice, and she has this class called Cultural Competency. And she had this excellent paper that I feel like everyone has read at this point about that. I think having her will help a lot, but I want to be careful of also the minority tax. I don't want her to have all the burden of all of these things. It's definitely a case of, like, I want to do everything I can to help myself first before asking her what else I can do, just because I don't want to put that extra burden on her. I've already felt some of that burden as being one of the women in the room. Like, I was recently on a committee where I was the most senior female in the room. And I'm like, I'm an assistant professor of the practice. Why am I the most senior woman in this room? And the other women in the room were the grad student and the undergrad. And so I found myself basically, to a certain extent, amplifying their voices to make sure their voices were being heard in that committee. Like, it's great that they were there. Like, I think Duke is great in the sense that they often will have a grad student and an undergrad student on committees to give that voice. But in some ways, I'm not surprised it was a woman. They're women students because women are more willing to volunteer for services. But yeah, it was interesting being in that committee because I was like, I'm not only going to voice my opinion, I'm also going to amplify their opinions. And there was one moment where I literally had to go, well, as a woman, I don't think we should do X, Y, and Z for ABC reasons. And only after I highlighted that did the other men in the room go like, oh, yeah. Well, as a man, I wouldn't want that to happen either. And I'm like, yeah, okay.
This excerpt of the CSK8 podcast is from episode number 51, which is titled Learning at Scale with Kristin Stephens-Martinez. You can listen to this full episode, as well as hundreds more, by simply searching for the CSK8 podcast on your favorite podcast app, or by going to jaredoleary.com.